She believes that Bill Gates created the COVID pandemic.
The interdimensional demonic pedophiles.
And I said to him, you realize that they believe Democrat politicians and celebrities are literally eating babies? And then he messaged back, yeah, I believe that.
A lot of this is a fine line between, heartbreaking and hilarious.
Courtney Hurd, thanks so much for coming on to Talk Beliefs all the way from British Columbia in Canada. Now, people will know you as the Godless Mom with a very popular website and podcast of the same name. Your current podcast, however, is Q Dropped, where you speak to people whose friends and family have been sucked into the infamous QAnon cult of recent years, a cult which began online with messages from the mysterious Q, affecting its followers' political and religious outlooks. Well, Courtney, you've been very busy indeed with the new Q Drop podcast. It certainly is a labor of love for you. It's still a very new podcast. So how has it been received?
Pretty well, actually. We're quite surprised. We are getting around, we're 3 months into it now, and we're getting around 4,000 downloads per episode. So, but yeah, it's been received really well. We get a lot of messages from people saying that it really means a lot to them and that it's helping them kind of cope with their own situations.
Where we go one, we go on. Where we go one, we go on.
Well, today we'll not only be delving into the origins of QAnon, but also your own experience with the cult. Courtney, on the Q Drop podcast, you talk about QAnon in depth with those affected by it. But for anyone who doesn't know, what is the QAnon phenomenon all about, and how did it start?
Well, it started in October 2017, if I'm recalling correctly. There's a lot of dates to remember. And essentially what happened was somebody named Q posted on 4chan, I believe was the first place that was posted. Pretending to, well, I don't know if it's pretending, but they insinuated that they had ties to the government. They had inside information. And what they did was they proceeded to leave these cryptic messages on boards such as 4chan, and then they later moved to 8chan, about predictions about the future, about what's really going on and all of this stuff. And the people on these boards started to interpret these messages and pick them apart, and they have these whole forums devoted to picking them apart and figuring out what it's supposed to mean and stuff like that. And so you can have two different QAnon followers who believe in very different things because it's all up for interpretation. And if you actually read these messages by this person named Q, they're very, very cryptic, and two people can get very different things from them. But essentially, it has pulled in conspiracy theories that we've all heard before and some new ones and mixed them all together. It literally encompasses like every conspiracy you've pretty much ever heard of, and has convinced people that this is what's really going on. And of course, when the pandemic happened, that kind of kicked it into high gear. And so it's now, there's a lot of people who think that there's a big conspiracy going on amongst the Hollywood elites, the political elites around the world, and they are all in this cabal that is essentially trafficking children and consuming children to stay young and stuff like that. So it is very, very strange. And sadly, a lot of people buy it.
Courtney, your own parents were sucked into the QAnon cult several years ago. So if we were to go right back to your earliest memories, how would you describe your childhood?
My childhood was amazing. My parents were amazing. My parents were my heroes. They were very adventurous. So they took us all over the world. We traveled through Southeast Asia, the South Pacific. We lived in Australia. We drove a camper van around New Zealand, and this was my childhood. It was just filled with adventure, and we didn't have a lot of money, so it was really my parents being creative with how they spent their money, and like they weren't very materialistic. They would rather spend their money on the experiences that we had. My mom was a school teacher, but she was a school teacher that she taught her class differently than most teachers, and she got a lot of flack for that. She had a program that she ran in her class that my dad actually helped develop that involved kids. It got kids super involved in school in a way that they loved it. It was very successful. She had like a 2-page spread in the Vancouver newspaper when I was younger. My dad was a social worker he focused on crisis counseling. So he was constantly working with, sex workers, people who were suicidal, people who had been through severe traumas, people who were just out of prison, stuff like that. He devoted his entire life to fighting for the little guy, standing up for the little guy. And they both raised us with very left-wing ideals, equality, human rights, all of that stuff. And they were hippies. They protested the Vietnam War. And because of all of that, because of their views on the Vietnam War and stuff like that, they had like a natural kind of aversion to authority. And they always like encouraged my brother and I to stand up to authority figures when we saw that something was not right. And to a degree, I agreed with that, but it kind of, it can be taken to an extreme, which they certainly did take it to an extreme. But yeah, they were, I mean, we're not religious. I was raised without religion. I didn't really know what God or church was until I was like 10 or 11. And yeah, that's really where it stemmed from. And I think also my mom kind of had this obsession growing up with anti-aging and nutrition and health. I think because it kind of gave her like this feeling of control over when she died. Her whole family was kind of driven by this fear of getting old. And so they were constantly talking about how to prolong your life, how to look younger, how to eat healthier. They were quite obsessed with it. They still are, with the exception of 2 of her siblings. She had 4 siblings, but the other 3 of them were quite obsessed with those things.
So your relationship with your parents was a good one right up to when you became an adult, but after they retired and you and your brother moved away from home, there was a definite void in their lives. And this is where the seduction of conspiracy theories came in. Isn't that right?
Yeah, well, first it started with my mom's obsession with health and anti-aging and all of that stuff. She started to kind of, with all of her free time, she had also retired. So she was retired and we weren't living at home. She had a lot of time on her hands and she had the internet. So she would go on the internet and she would just be obsessed with reading about alternative medicine, natural remedies, and all of this stuff. And so she would call my brother and I anytime we showed any inkling of having any kind of ailment, any kind of cold or anything like that. It was just constant remedies she was pushing on us. And she would phone us all the time and email us all the time with all of these remedies and these health concoctions that she'd discovered online. And it was driving my brother and I crazy. So my brother and I, we were both internet professionals. We made her a blog because we didn't want to deal with it anymore. So we're like, okay, instead of calling us, you can write this blog and talk to other people about it. And so we made this blog for her, and she started to actually gain like a following on Facebook. She had a Facebook page, and it kind of morphed from there into just like a little bit of dabbling in conspiracy theories here and there. But the thing is we still had a great relationship for all of this time. We had a great relationship up until the pandemic hit. And the pandemic is when we started to notice them saying some weird things. In the beginning of the pandemic, I remember my dad was arguing with me in the backyard. We were outside because we didn't want to expose anybody to anything. And we were arguing about masks. And I talked to my dad about the scientific evidence that I had read, and I told him I would send him links to peer-reviewed studies and stuff like that. And he basically said that he didn't care about facts. He only cared about his emotions. He actually said that like word for word. So that was like the first thing that kind of made us a little bit like, what's going on here? But what really kind of kicked it into high gear for us when we realized that something was wrong was when the vaccines came out. And we had been talking to my parents up until the vaccines came out. We've been talking to my parents about when the vaccines come out, we're all going to go get vaccinated. We're going to book our appointments. And my parents were in agreement. They were saying, yep, we're going to do that. But then when the vaccines actually rolled out and we started urging them to book their appointments, they kept making excuse after excuse after excuse until finally my brother and I were like, what is going on? Something else is going on here. So we confronted them. And immediately after we confronted them, we got this email from my mom, and well, it was my mom who wrote it, but it was from both of them, that was completely unhinged. I don't even know how to describe it. It was about like this secret cabal that was running the world, and the vaccines were, or COVID was both not to be worried about, but also developed to be population control. So I don't know which it is. And then the vaccines, of course, she literally wrote in an email that the vaccines contained a microchip, and it was designed to track them, you know, she said on her phone that she carries around in her pocket. And then they talked about one of the funniest things that she said was that the Ever Given, the boat that got stuck in the Suez Canal, was it had become lodged because it was full of the dead bodies of children. And I don't understand the science of that. I don't know how dead bodies make boats become lodged, but this is the email that I got from them, and my brother and I immediately text each other, and we're like, oh my gosh, they are full on QAnon. My parents didn't know what QAnon was, and I still don't think that they do, but it is everything that they believe is from QAnon. It stems from these posts on 4chan and 8chan.
And I know your last guest said that the pandemic was like rocket fuel for the QAnon phenomenon.
Yes. So I think that they had been kind of diving down this rabbit hole for a long time. And it was really weird because my parents fought for the rights of the LGBTQ community long before it was ever in the normal discourse. They fought for Indigenous rights long before hashtag Every Child Matters came around. You know, they did all of these things. They were clear left-wing people, and all of a sudden they are praising Trump and the people who kind of work with him.
It shows they must have been reading a lot of you know, these Reddits or whatever they were, the 4chans.
Yeah.
Consuming a lot of detail.
Well, they weren't getting it from 4chan, which is why they don't know what QAnon is. Because what happens is like the Q drops, which are the posts from this Q person on 4chan and 8chan, they get interpreted by all these people on 4chan and 8chan, and then those interpretations get turned into like articles and YouTube videos and Rumble videos and all of that stuff. And people are sharing memes about it on Facebook. And the people who are sharing this stuff don't necessarily know where it came from. They're just sharing it because it quote unquote makes sense to them. And so my parents consumed all of this content through Facebook and through the websites that my mom used to frequent when she looked at natural remedies. One of the websites is called Natural News, owned by Mike Adams, who is a piece of work. But yeah, that's where they get all their information so they don't actually connect it to QAnon. But what happened after that was that my brother and I then like sat down and talked to them, and I used talked loosely because we were quite angry. And we were both raised obviously by a therapist or a counselor, so we were raised to express our emotions. So it's quite normal for our family. When we're mad, we get mad. But we tried to debunk the things that they said, and we sent them lots and lots of information on the vaccines. We sent them lots of information on all the different things that they said. And then we sent them this documentary called The Social Dilemma, which is on Netflix. Excellent documentary. It's essentially about the algorithms in social media that kind of feed you what you want to see and keep you in your echo chamber, essentially. And we sent that to them. And a little while later, they emailed us back and they said, holy crap, we've been duped. They said that they see what we were talking about now and how they've been tricked, and that they're sorry and that they'll go and get vaccinated. And I was shocked because I didn't think that would happen. And I actually went with them to get their first dose of vaccination. So I saw it happen. And that is the single thing that convinced me that they had actually changed their mind. Because how can you convince somebody to get vaccinated if they hadn't changed their mind about that? So yeah, we were at that point pretty happy. We thought that we had fixed the problem and our parents were vaccinated. So mission accomplished.
Well, it seemed that your parents had only flirted with QAnon and were back on track to living the lives they'd always lived. But sadly, that just wasn't to be.
No. It was January of 2021. No, 2022 that we just had a great Christmas. We thought everything was back to normal. And then in January, my brother logged into their investment accounts because he does investments for them. And he saw that the accounts had been drained. And so he, immediately he was scared. And I had been having conversations with my parents about things going on in the world. And when they don't want to, or when they disagree with me, they kind of change the subject. They won't confront me. They won't tell me that they disagree with me. They'll change the subject. So I know when I'm talking to them about something and they change the subject suddenly, they don't want to talk about that because they disagree with me. So there was a few things that they were doing that with that kind of made me think, okay, something's wrong again. And then my brother logs into this investment system that they were a part of, and they had drained their accounts. And he confronted them. He said, where's that money? Not accusatory or anything like that. He was just concerned. He wanted to make sure that they knew where it was, because sometimes people can gain access to stuff. And they wouldn't tell him. They refused to tell him. And we still don't know. We have a few theories. We think that maybe they donated to the Freedom Convoy in Canada. We think that maybe they could have bought gold, because a lot of QAnoners believe that we're headed back to the gold standard, which is, of course, ridiculous. We also think that there's a possibility that they invested in a crypto called Quantum Dollar, which has been pushed by a lot of QAnon leaders lately, which essentially is just like setting your money on fire. And so it became clear that they are once again down this rabbit hole, or that they never left and they just got the vaccines thinking that they could counteract it with some kind of natural remedy that my mom found online. So they haven't had their boosters. My dad's had 2 doses. My mom's had 1. That I saw. She claims she had 2, but I didn't see the second one, so I don't believe her. And yeah, there's just a lot of lying and a lot of deceit, a lot of just pushing right-wing ideas now all of a sudden, and a lot of hate. Like my parents, who raised me to be loving and to fight for equal rights and human rights and all of that, are suddenly centering their lives around hatred, which is weird. And I'll give you an example of that. It was at Christmas. My dad suddenly piped up and said that he really likes Danielle Smith, who is the premier of Alberta, the province right next to us. She is like a crazy QAnon believer. She is anti-LGBTQ. She's trying to like get rid of our universal health care. She's just a piece of work, and she's the last person on earth my dad would ever have supported. And I asked him why. What is it that you like about her? And he said that she had said that she hates Trudeau, and that's it. He literally said to me, word for word, that he does not know anything else about her, and that's all he knows about her, and that's enough for him to like her, is just that she hates Trudeau. He's literally centering his political worldview around hatred. So that is kind of where we are now. They're still down the QAnon rabbit hole.
And you said that that you all grew up not really believers. Like, could that money have gone to a church? Because a lot of QAnon people are believers.
Yeah, they were atheists as well my whole life. And recently they've been saying things like, when my brother was sick, they started to text him things like, "We're praying for you." Just crazy. Like, this would never come out of their mouths ever. So we also, we wonder if maybe they've been duped into donating to some kind of church. They're accepted Jesus as their savior. I don't know how that competes with Trump as their savior, but yeah, it's a possibility.
Well, the Q phenomenon has changed and evolved in the relatively short time it's been in existence. Would you say that this cult is phasing out now, or might it evolve into something even more insidious?
I think that what we are referring to nowadays as QAnon may disappear at some point in the future, I hope. But I think that what it's referring to will stick around. I think the thing is conspiracy theories have always existed. Humans have always been just fascinated by the idea of these conspiracy theories. And I don't think that's going away. I think the reason why this seems worse, and it is, I think, worse, is because of the internet. It's because they've been able to share these ideas so easily and attract new recruits, for lack of a better word, so easily. and just create panic and fear everywhere really, really easily. I think that this is a new way that we're dealing with conspiracy theories. Like when I was in my 20s, I used to love reading about conspiracy theories, but it was never serious to me. Like I wasn't going to make life decisions based on it. It was just like, what if, just like a fun conversation topic.
I'm sure your parents were the same initially.
Yeah, absolutely. We used to have conversations with them about like, oh, who shot JFK? Just you'd watch the JFK movie. Yeah, it was fun. It was never serious. It was just what if kind of situations. None of us actually believed for a fact all of these things. And now I think with the internet and the ease with which this information is disseminated is what is making people hang on to it and truly believe in it. And I think that the pandemic added to that as well, because the pandemic is a scary thing. It's a scary thing for every single one of us. And it's a lot less scary to believe that it was created by humans, because we can defeat humans. If we're just sitting here waiting to be wiped out by Mother Nature, that's a little bit more scary. It's a little bit less like you feel like you have less control over it. So I think that this whole conspiracy theory gives people a reason to feel less scared about the pandemic. But I think going forward, we're going to continue to deal with some iteration of these crazy conspiracy theories. We're always going to have factions of people who believe in it to their core and act on it. I think that in the future, we're going to see more violence as a result of it. And I think that if we don't do something soon to find a way to get back to a shared reality, that bad things can happen. I really believe that.
Well, you're known as the host of the Godless Mom podcast and now the Q Dropped podcast. Courtney, can you tell us your story of deciding to become a podcaster and why Q Dropped is so important to today's listening audience?
Yeah, I did have a podcast called Godless Moms with Janice Selby. And that was fun, but it kind of fizzled out a little bit. We got really busy, both of us. And then the whole QAnon thing with my parents kind of made me not really want to sit there on screen and smile at everybody for a little while there. So, yeah, it kind of fizzled out. And then when my parents went down the QAnon rabbit hole and we were dealing with all of this stuff, it was very difficult for me to kind of keep it in. And I started writing about it on my blog. And then I realized that I had a lot to say, and I was constantly talking to my husband about it. And we both kind of decided, well, why don't we turn this into a podcast? Because that's just how I deal with things. I told you I was raised by a counselor, so I talk everything out, right? So, so it's kind of like my therapy. And I was reading the QAnon Casualties subreddit and realized that a lot of people are going through the same thing, and that not enough people really understand that this is happening, that this is actually tearing apart families. We get a lot of people saying, what's the big deal? It's just a difference of opinion. But if you listen to our last episode, you hear this man whose quote unquote soulmate thought he was a demon and threatened to have him killed and framed for a crime. And that is not a difference of opinion. That is not at all a difference of opinion. And I think people don't really understand just how deeply QAnon is affecting some families. I'm lucky because my parents respect my boundaries. I've told them I don't want to hear about it. I told them I don't want the emails about it. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want this in my life. And if you talk to my son about it even once, you don't get to see him anymore. So they don't say anything about it when they're around us, which is perfect. It sucks that we can't really talk about a whole lot because everything is kind of tied into politics, you know. There's very few topics of conversation that we can talk about, and in our relationship going way back, we've always been able to talk about everything, even things that other people would think were crazy to talk about. Like, I was always open with them about my sex life and everything like that. Like, there was nothing we couldn't talk about. And now all of a sudden it's like, maybe there's 2 topics that we can talk about. So it's kind of a different relationship, but at least I still have one. So I'm quite lucky. A lot of people are not that lucky. A lot of people have legitimately lost people from their life. They've divorced them. They are in custody battles with them. They've been having to call the police and get restraining orders from them. There's so many people out there who are suffering. I think the story that kind of sat with me the most was we weren't able to get an interview from this person, but they posted their story on QAnon Casualties and said that he was a survivor of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas school shooting. So he was a child, you know, in high school and living at home with his parents, where you're supposed to be protected and supported and loved, especially when you're going through some kind of trauma. But his father, who lived in the same house as him, became convinced that this was a false flag event and that his son was a crisis actor. Yeah, it's like, this is not just a difference of opinion. And I really, I think, like, my mission is to make people understand that this is simply not just a difference of opinion.
Well, it's amazing work that you're doing, Courtney. I just want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come on to the show today. I will leave links to your podcast, Patreon, and social media in the description below, and hopefully we can have you back on the show in the very near future.
I would absolutely love to be back on the show. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a great conversation.